What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. We're inching closer to the NFL draft, and we're going to continue our draft coverage today, specifically by looking at the Packers' top 30 visits and the players that they've brought in for their pre-draft visits up until this point. They've brought in 26 players. This used to be a topic that I never even discussed or went over because for the most part, especially under Ted Thompson, even early under Brian Gutekunst, these didn't mean a whole heck of a lot. They would use these, and they still use these at sometimes to maybe recruit some undrafted free agent type players, but the top guys in the draft, either they wouldn't bring in or they didn't really actually have interest in drafting those players. For the longest time, it was almost like if you had a player in for a pre-draft visit, you could just take that player off of Green Bay's board going into the draft because it seemed like they never actually ended up with those type of players. However, that changed quite a bit last season. Before I get there, if you're not familiar, a pre-draft visit or a top 30 visit, the Packers can bring up to 30 prospects into their facilities for a further evaluation and a more in-depth look at a prospect. So they are allowed 30 of those prior to the draft. So far, Green Bay has used 26 of those. And why I say things have changed more recently, last year there were 29 reported visits, at least the ones that we knew about. I'm sure they probably did 30, but we knew about 29 of them. These were some of the players that they brought in during their visit just last season. Tariq Carpenter, Devonte Wyatt, Samori Toure, Christian Watson, Rasheed Walker, Romeo Doubs, and a player you may not know as much about, but Jean Delance, who they brought in as a practice squad player at the end of last year and is still on the roster. So that's Carpenter, Wyatt, Toure, Watson, Rasheed Walker, Romeo Doubs, and Jean Delance. 7 players of the 29 that we know they brought in a season ago are currently on their roster. 6 of them they drafted, including a first rounder in Devonte Wyatt and a second rounder, early second, who they moved up to get in Christian Watson. So this has been something last year that they utilized to take a really good look at players that they were extremely interested in and actually ended up drafting or, again, acquiring later in the year, in Jean Delance's case, to their roster. And again, 7 of the 29 that we had reported, basically about 1 in 4, are now on the roster, which is absolutely crazy. So if you almost look at that with the 26 players that we know right now, you can almost pencil in 4 or 5 of those guys as potential members of the Green Bay Packers this upcoming season in some capacity. Now, as far as why a team would bring a player in for a pre-draft visit, there are a variety of reasons in doing so. The first could be to get a medical update. Either they didn't get enough of an update, at the combine or at the pro day, or they want to do a check-in. Hendon Hooker, who we'll talk about more in just a moment, is a player that they brought in for a visit. That very easily could just be a medical update. They want to see how he's recovering from that torn ACL, how he's progressing, will he be able to play this year, those sort of things. That could be very important in their evaluation of Hendon Hooker. So a lot of times it can just be a medical check. Another time it could be a board buster. They brought in 3 of the top tight ends, Dalton Kincaid, Darnell Washington, and Michael Mayer in their pre-draft visits this year. We'll go over all of these in just a moment, but that easily could be a situation where they like all 3 tight ends and they want to really get all 3 in the facility and get, sort of a hands-on, like let's look at all of them in person really close up. And obviously they've seen all of these guys, but when you bring them into the facility, it just feels a little bit different. And you want to see, all right, which one of these guys feels like a Green Bay Packer? Green Bay might have the ability to take the top tight end in this year's draft. All 3 of these guys could potentially go round 1. They might just want to eye all 3 of them up and say, all right, we have a feel for which one we think is best, but maybe let's get all 3 in the facility and really let this, sort of sort itself out and really get a great feel for which one we feel is going to be the best member of the Green Bay Packers. So it could be a legitimate board buster where you've got guys stacked evenly and you want to try to separate those things out. That could be a reason that you bring these guys in. A character evaluation could be another one. Maybe you got a bit of a sour taste in your mouth after an interview at the combine or at a pro day, and you want to bring the player back in to see, all right, does that check out? Or, maybe do we just catch the guy on the wrong day? Something like that. It could be that, you had your character evaluation filled out and then something additional happened. Darnell Wright, who the Packers brought in, he had the weird interaction online with I don't know if it was a reporter or a draft analyst or what it was, but he went aggressively in the DMs of that draft analyst or reporter, whoever it was, and in it sort of an odd way. And that may have happened after the Packers had brought Darnell Wright, and I don't know the timeline there, but theoretically, you could say like, all right, maybe we need to do a little bit more background work on a specific player. Let's bring him in for a visit. That's a reason you could do it. It could legitimately be subterfuge, meaning let's say Green Bay has no real want or desire to take a tight end in round one. I don't know that that's the case. It could be the case. It might not be the case. But let's say they have no real desire to take a tight end round one. By bringing in Darnell Washington and Michael Mayer and Dalton Kincaid, as well as 3 other tight ends, you're giving off the impression, some real huge tight end vibes, that you are very likely or at least potentially thinking of taking a tight end round one. You might say, well, does it really matter if other teams think that the Packers are going to take a tight end in round one? It could. And you could say, if you're giving off all those vibes that the Packers are going to take a tight end round one and they really didn't have interest in doing so, maybe if you can leak enough stuff out there that they're really interested in Dalton Kincaid, something that's been actually out there, that they're really interested in Michael Mayer, something that's been out there. If that's the case, maybe, just maybe, a team trades up in front of Green Bay to take one of those tight ends. And Green Bay had no interest in taking them anyway. And now you have one more player off your board that you weren't interested in taking, and maybe one more player on your board that actually you were interested in taking. So it's not to say necessarily that this actually works out the way that you're expecting, but a lot of times teams will use these sort of visits and leak information and show interest to just give off a vibe, and sometimes that can actually end up working out in your favor. So that's another reason teams can do it. Another one, as I mentioned, is your undrafted free agent recruiting. So as soon as the draft ends, actually before the draft ends, as day 3 starts kicking off, teams are constantly in contact with prospects that they think are going to go undrafted. And they start recruiting these players, and they start trying to make their pitches and how much they're going to give in a signing bonus to get them to their team. And it is a mad dash. All of a sudden, you go from draft over to the teams are going to sign 20, 25 undrafted free agents to fill out their 90-man rosters. Now imagine that's 20, 25 guys split amongst 32 teams. There is a mad dash to try to get these free agents in your building and to try to make them members of your team before some other team signs them as an undrafted free agent. And one of the best ways to make it so that your team stands out is by having them in for a pre-draft visit, by saying hey, you've seen our facility, you know what we're about, you've met with our coaches, you've done all of that. You haven't done that with other teams. We actually showed a legitimate interest in you, brought you in for a pre-draft visit. And it doesn't always work out, but a lot of times that can go a long way in undrafted, free agents making their decision. Sometimes you might have 8 to 10 teams that are vying for your service after the draft. And what are you going to do? You might go with the one that sticks out to you, the one that actually brought you in and showed interest in you, real legitimate interest in the process, and brought you in for a top 30 visit. Teams only have 30 of those. So if you're an undrafted guy and a team brought you in for a visit, that's a pretty big deal. And that can go a long way, as I mentioned, with players as they're making their decision of what teams they're going to go with as undrafted free agents. So that is a sort of recruiting tool that teams can use and Green Bay has used in the past. And then lastly, it can legitimately be just a check on a candidate that they have a ton of interest in. It could be that they have a ton of interest in Michael Mayer and they have all the intentions of the world of picking him at pick 15, but they just wanted to bring him in and do one more check and have one more handshake and meet with the coaches just to do that final, all-inclusive wrap of that player. They've already done the medical checks and the evals, and the scouts have talked to him, and the scouts have seen him. They've seen him live. They've seen him in person. They've studied the tape. They've got everything they need, every box check that they need, but they just want to have that one last final put the ribbon and bow on the present and say, all right, we just want to make sure that this is still the guy that we thought, that we've talked to all along through this process. And it can legitimately be that as well. So there's a variety of reasons that teams may use these visits. All of them are legitimate, and all of them could be the case with the 26 players that Green Bay has brought in so far. And by the way, it's possible they've brought in 30 guys so far, and we just haven't heard about the other 4. But as of right now, we know of 26 that they've actually brought in. And really quickly, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Just because a team doesn't bring a player in for a pre-draft visit doesn't mean that they're not insanely interested in a player. In fact, a team might not want to tip their hand that they are interested in a player. So let's say Green Bay is extremely interested in Broderick Jones, and like that's their guy. By not bringing him in, like you're not tipping your hand that you're super interested in Broderick Jones. And maybe teams aren't thinking Green Bay's interested in him. And maybe a team, again, picking at pick 16, 17, 18, isn't thinking that Green Bay's going to pick Broderick Jones. They're thinking that Green Bay's going to pick one of those 3 tight ends because of the interest they showed. So they may be less likely to trade up ahead of Green Bay to go get Broderick Jones, which means he falls to Green Bay at 15 and they can actually go out and select their guy. So again, it should go without saying, but just because they don't bring a guy in for a visit, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested. In fact, there have been on numerous occasions where a player will be asked on the day that they're drafted or the next day when they actually interview with the media, and they're asked like, hey, did Green Bay show interest in you? And they're like, no, I had no idea that Green Bay had any interest in me whatsoever. And a lot of times that's because Green Bay knew they had extreme interest and they didn't want to tip their hand to anyone that they could potentially be interested in that player. So again, that's just another piece of the process that all goes into this crazy draft period where every team's trying to lie and not show their hand and be a little bit secretive. As I mentioned, though, these pre-draft visits have meant something, and especially this past year with all the guys that they got. So that being said, here are the players that Green Bay has brought in for pre-draft visits so far, and I'm going to go position by position. Starting at quarterback, they brought in both Hendon Hooker and Sean Clifford, 2 players I discussed the other day in our quarterbacks episode. At running back, Keaton Mitchell, Evan Hull, and Lou Nichols III. At wide receiver, Dontavian Wicks, Cole Tucker, Rashee Rice, and Ryan Miller. Tight end, Michael Mayer, Dalton Kincaid, Darnell Washington, Josh Wiley, and Ben Sims. Offensive tackle, Darnell Wright. Interior offensive lineman, Antonio Mafi. Defensive lineman, Adetomiwa Adebawore, and Jaquelin Roy. Edge, Will McDonald, Felix Anudike Uzama, and Keon White. Linebacker, Marte Mapu, who's making the transition from safety. Corner, Tyreek Stevenson. Safety / slot, Jartavius Martin and Jamie Robinson, and then true safety, Jordan Howden. If you're counting along at home, that is 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 4 wide receivers, 5 tight ends, 1 offensive tackle, 1 interior offensive lineman, 2 defensive linemen, 3 edge rushers, 1 linebacker, 1 corner, and 3 safeties. So they've certainly brought in a broad range of players at a variety of different positions, with tight end leading the way and wide receiver following it with 4. That should not be a surprise to anyone with the current depth chart at tight end and wide receiver. If you're sort of breaking it down by where these players are expected to be selected, in the first round, you'd potentially be looking at Michael Mayer, Dalton Kincaid, Darnell Washington, Darnell Wright, and maybe Keon White. That could be another possibility. That was an interesting one. He was invited to the draft. I don't know that a lot of people were expecting that. If you're invited to the draft, that usually means you're a pretty solid lock to go in the first round. I think a lot of people had some early second round to mid second round grades on Keon White. I know Daniel Jeremiah was very high on him, had him really high. I think he had him in the top 10 early in the process. I think he's brought him down a little bit more, but that could be an interesting, sneaky player that Green Bay has a lot of interest in. So keep an eye on that one. In the second round, Hendon Hooker, Will McDonald, Felix Anudike Uzama, and Adetomiwa Adebawore. I think all of those are probably more second round players. In the third round, Rashee Rice, Tyreek Stevenson, Quan Martin, and Jamie Robinson. In the fourth, Dontavian Wicks and Marte Mapu. In the fifth, Keaton Mitchell, Josh Wiley, and Jaquelin Roy. In the sixth, Evan Hull, Antonio Mafi. And then in the seventh, Jordan Howden, an undrafted free agent, Sean Clifford, Lou Nichols, Cole Tucker, Ryan Miller, and Ben Sims. I think that's probably where you're looking at each of these players to go. So not only did you have a variety of positions that Green Bay was interested in, you had a variety of players throughout the draft, meaning that they could theoretically get maybe one of these guys almost in every single round of the draft as well. And then you look at, like, are these classic Green Bay types? Hendon Hooker, we don't know exactly because he didn't do the testing. Sean Clifford had a 9.04 RAS score, and he fits everything that Green Bay is looking for athletically at quarterback. Keaton Mitchell, only a 6.18 RAS score, but had a 91st percentile vertical jump, a 93rd percentile broad jump, a 98th percentile 40-yard dash. Really, the only thing he doesn't hit what they usually look for at running backs is the weight. But overall, still a speed back that hits kind of a lot of their thresholds. Evan Hull, 9.32 RAS, and as Jacob Morley likes to say, a tier 1 Packers running back for what they usually like to look for. Lou Nichols III didn't do a lot of the testing, so we don't know if he's going to actually fit their profile or not. Dontavian Wicks, a 9.17 RAS score. Again, as Jacob Morley would say, a tier 1 Packers wide receiver. Rashee Rice, 9.53, tier 1 Packers wide receiver. Everything that they look for. Cole Tucker, 4.41 RAS score. Interestingly enough, he was slightly off on the weight and slightly off on the 40-yard dash, but a lot of the other things they generally look for, he actually does hit. Ryan Miller, 6.97 RAS score, hits size, 40, and 3-cone, which are three of the big things that they look for there. Michael Mayer is a tier 1 tight end with a 7.66 RAS score. Dalton Kincaid, we don't know because he didn't do testing. Darnell Washington, a 9.88 RAS score, and again, hits everything Green Bay looks for at tight end. Josh Wiley, 8.98 RAS score, everything Green Bay looks for at tight end. Ben Sims, 8.39 RAS score. Darnell Wright, 9.68. And then, again, everything that they look for. Antonio Mafi did not do testing. That very possible that they brought him in for a medical check. Adetoyama Adebaware, 9.72 RAS score as a defensive lineman. As a defensive lineman, 9.88 as an edge rusher. Again, he is very much the prototypical Packers edge rusher / defensive lineman. Jaquelin Roy, 3.73 RAS score only. Doesn't really fit their threshold. So that one could be a little bit of subterfuge, or maybe they just wanted to do a little bit more research on him. Will McDonald, 9.67 RAS score, but well below their normal weight thresholds. Felix Anadike Uzama, 8.73, but also a little bit below their weight thresholds. That's going to be an interesting one. Also didn't do all the testing. Keon White, 9.55 RAS score. Didn't quite meet their usual broad jump score and is 24 years old, but hits absolutely everything else. Marte Mapu did not do testing, so that could be another player that they wanted to bring in to do a medical check on, see how he's doing. Tyreek Stevenson, 8.94, slightly out of their 3-cone testing, but not by much. And certainly as you get into day 2, day 3 of the draft, you can start compromising a little bit of those and not being so strict and stringent on some of your thresholds. Jartavius Martin, 9.29 RAS score, just slightly under 200 pounds, which is what they look for, but probably not enough to scare them off. Jamie Robinson, 6.06 RAS score, below height, below weight, below broad jump, and slightly below their normal, just general threshold. So not sure he'll totally be in play. And then Jordan Howden, 8.87 RAS score, slightly below the broad jump, but overall hits everything that they look for as well. So many Packer types, high RAS scores, extreme athletes. These are the types of players that the Packers generally like to look for and usually take in the draft, with a few, small, outliers here or there, specifically with Jaquelin Roy with a 3.73 RAS. Keaton Mitchell a little bit off, Cole Tucker a little bit off, but overall, like I said, almost every single one of these guys is coming either darn close or almost exactly hit Green Bay's thresholds at each of these positions. Hendon Hooker, we talked about the other day, 2nd round prospect, starting caliber quarterback, but going to be 26 years old this upcoming season, which is crazy. He's older than Jordan Love, torn ACL, still a developmental prospect. He could go round 1, which means Green Bay would have no shot at him because they're not going to take him at 15. And I think even in round 2, it's going to be a little bit steep for them. So probably not a player that they're actually looking at. I think with Hendon Hooker, you're probably looking at a medical check and you're just dotting all your I's and crossing your T's. Because what if all of a sudden Hendon Hooker falls to round 3 or round 4? There were quarterbacks just last year that fell a lot farther than I think a lot of people expected them to. So, it's not out of the question. All of a sudden one of these guys falls. You don't want to be caught not having all of the information that you need to make an educated decision. So probably Hendon Hooker just, kind of doing some due diligence in case he would fall to a position that they would actually consider taking him. Sean Clifford, I think, is a key undrafted free agent possibility. If they go out and draft 2 quarterbacks, probably not interested in Clifford. I think he maybe could sneak into that 7th round range, and Green Bay could potentially be interested in selecting him there, especially if they haven't drafted a quarterback yet at that point, but more likely probably an undrafted free agent guy that they're probably doing a little bit of recruiting for before he actually hits undrafted free agency. Keaton Mitchell, speed back, 4.37 40, led college football in 10-plus yard runs. A little bit on the, not going to be an inside the tackle guy, but I think he brings enough explosiveness, playmaking, could be maybe a little bit of a kick returner as well. Could be somebody that Green Bay's interested in. Evan Hull, like I said, hits all of Green Bay's thresholds at running back, is everything that they look for, catches the ball well, fantastic athleticism, does struggle as a blocker though, so that could leave a little bit to be desired there, but that's something that you hope you can teach up over time. Very much think that Green Bay's probably interested in him. Lew Nichols, 5'10", 220-pound power back with 3,000 plus college rushing yards. And as of this moment, he's still only 21 years old. Will turn 22 this summer, but probably more of an undrafted guy that they potentially could be interested in. Dontavian Wicks, raw wide receiver with all the tools, did take a step back in a new offense last year. That could be a key reason why they want to bring him in, is just to kind of see how he reacts, give him some stuff to do on the whiteboard, see if he's going to be able to pick up this Matt LaFleur offense. Those are all things that you bring players in for test or for further evaluation. I think that's a key reason why they may have brought him in. Rashee Rice, 96 catches, 1,355 yards, 10 touchdowns, 14.1 yard average this past year. Lacks the top end speed, but makes up for a lot of it in RAC, or run after catch. I think he could very much be on Green Bay's board, probably in that third-ish round range would be my guess. Cole Tucker, I'm not even going to pretend that I know a bunch about Cole Tucker. I will tell you, he was the 225th ranked player on Dane Brugler's board. No, not the 225th overall player on Dane Brugler's board, the 225th wide receiver that he had graded or ranked on his entire list. 225th at wide receiver. So this is a far back of the list wide receiver prospect who, if Green Bay is showing interest in, is probably going to end up in Green Bay as an undrafted free agent. Let's just put it that way. So I would expect to see Cole Tucker as a undrafted free agent. If you were a betting person, put some money on that happening after the draft. Ryan Miller, an interesting H-back type of player that I could see Matt LaFleur wanting to take a look at in undrafted free agency. We've gone over Mayer and Kincaid and Darnell Washington in great detail, so I'm not going to do that here, but 3 top-tier tight ends that could very much be in play for the Packers. I will say this as well. I think there's a good chance that if Green Bay likes all 3 of these tight ends and they confirm that by bringing them in for visits, I think it's possible that, let's say you're at 15 and all 3 are on the board, which is probably expected, and they like all 3 of them. Maybe they go from 15 to 20 and they get to 20 and maybe 2 of them are still on the board. So they go from 20 to 23 and they get to 23 and 2 of them are still on the board. Maybe now they trade back to 25 and now 1 of them's on the board. And in the meantime, you pick up a bunch of 3rd and 4th round picks, or maybe you get a 2nd rounder along the way. Who knows? But maybe you can actually pick up some additional picks, get a tight end that you had interested in at pick 15. Instead, you get them at pick 26 and you pick up some additional draft capital along the way. That could be another reason you bring all of these tight ends in, is to say like, hey, maybe there's not actually a differentiator and we would rather have the 3rd guy at pick 28 than the 1st guy at pick 15 and pick up a bunch of stuff along the way. So that's another reason they could have brought in these tight ends. Josh Wiley, rotational tight end, never had more than 353 yards in a season, but does have all the athletic traits that Green Bay tends to look for. Ben Sims lacks any real discernible breakout upside trait, but probably tops out as a number 3 tight end. Interesting player, not bad, not great, but like I said, probably is a number 3 tight end / special teams guy. Darnell Wright, everything Green Bay looks for, starting offensive tackle, probably day 1 at right tackle. He's a stud. He's an absolute stud. Would be a great pick at pick 15. Antonio Mafi went from rugby to defensive line to guard. He's raw, but he's physical. Probably doing a little bit of a medical check on him as well. Adebaware is all over the draft board. He's a freak athlete, but never really lived up to it in college. Sincerely, watch for him for Green Bay in round 2. I think there's a extremely, extremely good chance that Green Bay is super interested in Adebaware in round 2 if he is available. So put a little flag on that one. Jaquelin Roy looks the part, but is kind of an undersized defensive lineman who's more of a run stopper than a pass. I don't know. He's a weird one to evaluate, and he doesn't fit Green Bay's thresholds. I don't think he's actually in play for them, but that's a little bit of an interesting one. Will McDonald and Felix Anudike-Uzomah, both of them phenomenal edge rushers, know how to hunt a quarterback, held up better at the point of attack than you would ever expect based on their sizes. But they're both a little bit undersized for what Green Bay likes, especially Will McDonald. I don't necessarily think either are in play. If one of them are, it's probably Anudike-Uzomah. But they're both really fun pass rushers. And if Green Bay wanted to go into a different direction and bring more of a speed guy in, I think both of those guys could certainly be in play. Keion White, as mentioned, hits everything that Green Bay looks for, and I think could be a sneaky pick for Green Bay in round 1, especially if they maybe move down from like 15 to like 20 to 22. Keep a very strong eye on Keion White. Marte Mapu is probably going to make a transition from safety to linebacker, be a core special teamer, and be a matchup piece on defense. Green Bay's tried to do that in the past with Oren Burks. Hasn't always worked out the best. They've done some Raven Green stuff. I think this could be another project for them that kind of makes that safety to linebacker transition. Tariq Stevenson, more of a press man corner on the outside. Not sure he fits Green Bay right now, but again, you start getting into the third round and you just take talented players and you figure out the puzzle pieces later. Jartavius Martin, slot corner / safety, phenomenal athleticism. I think he is going to be a real legitimate option for them at safety in round 3. Jamie Robinson, slot safety as well. Doesn't really totally fit Green Bay's type, but I could see why they wanted to do some work on him, and the safety class just isn't that strong, and at some point they probably need to take one. So maybe Jamie Robinson, they like something more on tape than they saw in the actual athletic testing. That's always possible. And then Jordan Howden tested really well, probably a day 3 safety, core special teamer. My issue is like Green Bay has like 7 of these guys that are not starting caliber safeties. They're like 4th, 5th tier safeties and our core special teamers. Like Green Bay's whole roster is filled with those guys. So yeah, they like those guys, but they already have a ton. So I'm not sure it makes a ton of sense. If I were to take away all of the subterfuge and all of the stuff, I think these are the players that Green Bay could actually be interested in round by round. If we can take out some of the ones that are probably more medical checks, the Hendon Hookers and things like that. These are the ones that I think are real options. In the first round, Michael Mayer, Darnell Washington, Dalton Kincaid, Darnell Wright, and Keion White. I think those 5 are real options for them in round 1. In round 2, Darnell Washington, if he's still there, Keion White, if he would still somehow be there, Adetomiwa Adebawore, and Rashee Rice. I think all of those could be in play in round 2. In the third round, Rashee Rice, if he's still there, Quan Martin, and Dontavian Wicks, I think could all be in play in round 3, although Wicks would be probably a little rich in round 3. Dontavian Wicks in round 4 and Marte Mapu in round 4. I think those could be in play. In the 5th round, Keaton Mitchell and Josh Wiley. In the 6th, Evan Hull. In the 7th, Sean Clifford and Ben Sims. And undrafted free agents, Sean Clifford, Lou Nichols, Cole Tucker, Ryan Miller, and Ben Sims. Probably more your medical check guys, Hendon Hooker, Antonio Mafi, and Marte Mapu. That is going to do it for me today with all of these pre-draft visits. We still don't know 4 of the guys, so maybe that comes out in the next couple days as well. But some really fun prospects on this list of 26. I think all of them could potentially be in play for Green Bay. And as we saw just a season ago, don't rule any of these guys out. There is a real legitimate shot that Brian Gutekunst and company are very interested in more than a handful of names on this list. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you right back here tomorrow. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.